Good afternoon, dear friends, and welcome to the concluding panel of the 2021 Rīga Conference. As they say, we're saving some of the best for last, and Russia has been a subject that was mentioned, I believe, at every single discussion here at this conference over these past 2 days, beginning with the Prime Ministerial opening panel yesterday. And this is the panel that actually is fully dedicated to Russia, and specifically Russia's role in international affairs. And we have a group of very distinguished speakers with both geographic and expert diversity who will be taking part in this panel, some of us here in person, some of our colleagues will join online. And I want to, first of all, on behalf of, I believe, all the speakers at this panel, thank the organizers of the Riga Conference for finding a way in the middle of all this craziness that we're living through to actually get us here together. And it's good to see so many friends here in the room, in person. I think one of the main lessons we all learned in these past 18 months at how indispensable and irreplaceable real human contact actually is. And it's really wonderful to see so many friends after such a long time. A couple of weeks ago, the 3 Baltic embassies in Moscow held a joint reception. It's called the Baltic Freedom Reception to commemorate the 100th anniversary of full diplomatic recognition and the 30th anniversary of the restoration of independence. And it was hosted actually at the Latvian embassy in Moscow, but on behalf of all 3 Baltic ambassadors. And this was the first diplomatic reception in Moscow since COVID began, so since the spring of 2020. And the reception started at 6 p.m. And at midnight, the security service had to politely start pushing people out the door because everybody was so starved for actually seeing real human beings that nobody wanted to leave. So thank you so much to the Latvian Atlantic Association and all the organizers of the conference for bringing us all here. And those of you who are tweeting about this discussion or this conference in general, the hashtag is, I keep forgetting what this thing is, but you know what I mean. And then Riga, hashtag Rīga Conf 2021, all in one word. So the subject of our conversation is Russia in international affairs. But as one of only 2 Russian speakers on this panel, I just want to say that I think it will be inevitable that in many of our remarks we will be also touching on the domestic, not only on the foreign policy of Russia, because one notion, one principle that we know of very well when it comes to the modern history of Russia, and I myself am a historian by education, is that domestic politics and foreign policy in my country are very closely connected, both in a bad way and in a good way. In a bad way, I think we have all witnessed and seen it in the last 2 decades since Vladimir Putin came to power. I have to say that many of us Russian Democrats were bewildered by the fact that so many Western leaders in the early years of Vladimir Putin's rule, even when it was already beyond clear what the direction of policy would be, were still trying to find a way to accommodate, cooperate, appease, choose whatever term you want, when Putin was already going after independent media, going after political opponents, falsifying elections, and so on and so forth. There were still Western leaders who engaged in resets and looked into Putin's eyes and got a sense of his soul, failing to see that very close and very direct connection between domestic repression and external aggressiveness that, when it comes to Russia, always go hand in hand. And in a way, it was a very short road, both metaphorically and literally, between the closure of the last independent television channel in Russia in the summer of 2003 and the first state-to-state territorial annexation in Europe since the end of the Second World War that Mr. Putin accomplished in the spring of 2014. But this is the connection in a bad way. But I think it's also very important for all of us to remember that this connection exists in a good sense as well, and perhaps no one is in a better position to judge this and remember this than the country that is hosting us today, and the Baltic states in general. Every time I'm in Tallinn, I always make a point of going to Nunne Street, which is in the just outside the old town, under the walls there, and the staircase leading to the upper part of the old town. And on the wall there, right next to that staircase, is a memorial plaque that was installed some years ago to honor and commemorate the role that Russian President Boris Yeltsin played in the peaceful restoration of the independence of the Baltic states. And I always like standing next to that memorial plaque and looking at the reaction from Western tourists. Of course, Tallinn is a vibrant tourist city. People from all over the world come there. And I very often read the bewilderment on people's faces as they read. The plaque bears inscriptions in 3 languages, Estonian, Russian, and English. And when people read this message, I often see the bewilderment on the face, because people cannot understand how is it possible that the president of Russia helped achieve the independence of Soviet captive nations. But that is exactly what happened. And of course, you in the Baltic states know this better than anybody. And in Lithuania, President Yeltsin was honored posthumously. This country, Latvia, was the only one of the 3 that actually managed to do this while he was still alive. And in 2006, we had yesterday remarks from former President Vaira Vike-Freiberg. In 2006, former President Yeltsin came here to Riga and was awarded the highest civilian honor of the Republic of Latvia, the Order of the 3 Stars, for that role he played in the early 90s in helping the Baltic states to restore independence. And I also want to recall, and this is important as well, that this was not just the position of President Yeltsin, although it was very important, the role he personally played, but it was also the position of Russian society. And in January of 1991, as Soviet tanks rolled on the streets of Vilnius, we had 500,000 people, 500,000 people standing right outside the Kremlin walls on Manezhnaya Ploshchad and Manezhny Square in Moscow, demonstrating in support of the freedom of the Baltic states with the slogans, Ruki proch at Litvy, hands off Lithuania. And this is Russia as well. So I think it is important to remember that this connection works not just in a bad way, which we are all seeing and which we will be discussing at this panel today, but also in a good sense, that when Russia itself is democratic, when Russia itself domestically aspires to such principles as the rule of law and free elections and respect for human rights and human dignity, this stance is very much reflected in foreign policy as well. So I just want us all to keep this in mind as we talk about not only about the situation today with the Putin regime, but also looking forward to what a post-Putin democratic Russia will look like and will do. Because that day will come. It may sound unrealistic today, just as unrealistic as the end of the Soviet regime seemed, let's say, at the beginning of 1991. But guess what? It happened. So I think it is very important for those of us who are involved in politics, in the expert community, in journalism, and so on, just remember those lessons of history, that sometimes, and very often, especially in our country, major political changes can happen like this, suddenly and unexpectedly, including unexpectedly for their own participants. So that may be another sort of question as we launch into this discussion. And I want to now present the distinguished panel of speakers that we have today, both here in person and online. We will first go to my compatriot who is joining us from Moscow, Dmitry Suslov. He serves as Deputy Director of the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies, as well as a Senior Lecturer at the Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. Dmitry is one of Russia's foremost experts on foreign policy, including on relations with the European Union and the United States. He's a member of the Valdai Club and regularly consults businesses, NGOs, and Russian government agencies in the field of international affairs. We will next go to Martin Krag, who is joining us here in person. Martin is the Deputy Director of the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies, as well as a Senior Research Fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. He's a scholar of Russian history and economy, holds a PhD from the Stockholm School of Economics, and is an Associate Professor at the Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies at the University of Uppsala. Next, also joining us here in person, and we are honored by his presence, is Arseniy Yatsenyuk, somebody who needs absolutely no introduction in this audience, but since it's my job as moderator, I will introduce him anyway. Chairman of the Kiev Security Forum, leader of the Popular Front Party, and Mr. Yatsenyuk, of course, has served in leading government positions in Ukraine over the past several years, including as Minister for the Economy and Foreign Affairs, as Speaker of the Verkhovna Rada, and of course most prominently between 2014 and 2016 as the Prime Minister of Ukraine, and he was of course one of the leaders of the Euromaidan revolution in 2014. Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, thank you so much for joining us. Then also joining us online will be Kate Hansen Bunt, Secretary General of the Norwegian Atlantic Committee. She's a political scientist and foreign policy analyst with a particular interest in German, general European, and transatlantic security. She chairs the board of the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs and also serves on the council of the Fridtjof Nansen Institute in Oslo. And last but certainly not least, we'll be joined by James Lamont, who is the director of the Democratic Resilience Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis, SIPA, in Washington, D.C., a recognized expert in foreign policy and national security. He has consulted foundations, Fortune 500 companies, as well as the United Nations, and is a regular media contributor, including with the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and Newsweek. And I neglected to introduce myself. My name is Vladimir Karamurza. I'm a Russian opposition politician, formerly chairman of the Boris Nemtsov Foundation for Freedom. And now, without further ado, I'm going to ask Dmitry Suslov to open our conversation. I will ask each of our speakers to keep to about 7 minutes of introductory words, so that way we can leave enough time for a conversation and also for questions from those of you who are here with us in the room, and also those who are joining us for this discussion online. So, Dmitry, the floor is yours. Dmitry, вам слово.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. It's a great honor and privilege for me to speak at such a distinguished panel, and I, of course, regret that I have to speak online. But on the other hand, while I compare myself with the speakers on the panel, I at least have a chance to speak now without a mask on my face. To begin with, let me a little bit disagree with Vladimir on the cruciality of domestic politics in Russia as a determinant of Russian foreign policy. Of course, without question, Russian domestic politics matters. With a different type of political regime and with a different president, Russia will have significant foreign policy adjustments, but I would not overestimate this factor and would definitely not consider it as the most predominant one. There are much more fundamental factors which predetermine Russian foreign policy, and even if we talk about Russian foreign policy in early 90s with Boris Yeltsin and Andrei Kozyrev, who is considered to be quite an exception for Russian foreign policy making. Look, even in early 1990s, Russia did not treat the other post-Soviet countries as equals. Russia did use the near-abroad concept vis-a-vis Ukraine and other post-Soviet countries. Russia did struggle against NATO enlargement and had ambitions which were greater than the Russian material resources at that time, and so on and so forth. So do not expect fundamental and crucial changes of Russian foreign policy after Putin and after a transformation. If there is a significant, well, in the longer term prospect, there will be, of course, but do not expect a fundamental change of Russian foreign policy. I think that the state of the international system, the structural factors, distribution of power, play a more significant role in determining Russian foreign policy. As of today, I think Russian foreign policy is devoted to strengthening itself as an independent global great power, which is a power which is fully independent in its domestic, foreign, and defense policies, not relying on anyone else to defend itself, not, adjusting its foreign policy interests with anyone else. A power which promotes Russia's centrism in the post-Soviet region, except for the Baltic states, and also tries to strengthen itself in the world at large, to take a full-fledged part in settling the global international order and to behaving as a very significant player in the regions which are not dominated by other great powers, such as the Middle East, which is indeed one of the most favorable places now for Russia to increase its influence and to conduct a policy of independent great power. Because in the Middle East, Russia is indeed independent, right? Not even allied with China. In a similar way in Africa. So very briefly, if we discuss Russian foreign policy, we need to distinguish it into three dimensions: the post-Soviet space, relations with the West, and relations with the non-West. In the post-Soviet space, from my perspective, Russia is not pursuing classical domination. Rather, instead of classical domination, Russia identifies certain red lines for the other post-Soviet countries, which are that they should not join economic and security orders of the others. They should not become instruments of the others in anti-Russian policies. in an instrument of containing Russia. And thrice, they should not create their identity against Russia, right? As Putin famously discussed with Ukraine as anti-Russia, right? They should not position themselves as anti-Russia. You know, if countries follow these requirements, if countries stay within those red lines, these countries preserve their territorial integrity, security, and moreover, Russia does not interfere into their domestic regimes, right? For instance, we have democratic Armenia, democratic Kyrgyzstan, autocratic Belarus, autocratic Kazakhstan and Tajikistan in the Russia-centric orbit, and Russia is absolutely okay with such a diversity, right? As long as they do not change their foreign policy orientation, right? As long as they do not cross those red lines, I mean, Russia is okay with their foreign relations and with the type of their domestic political regime, which they are free to develop by themselves. But if countries in the same region, again, except for the Baltic states, cross those red lines, and especially try to integrate into the security and economic, but security more important, of course, orbit of the others, that's it. Then Russia, of course, undermines those states. Well, and with the experience of Ukraine and Georgia, we know what happens then, right? And Russia is committed actually to preventing those countries from being successful. Russia tries to weaken, to undermine those countries, you know, to punish them, and so on. And this principle will stay. And again, I do not expect any significant alterations in the observable future. Relations with the West. Well, now we have confrontation with the West, both with the United States and the European Union. It is affordable in the observable future, and Russian policy towards both is devoted to managing this confrontation. With the United States now, we witness the stabilization of confrontation, or manageable confrontation, especially with the arrival of Biden administration. Both countries do not want further escalation of this confrontation, and both countries do not want to make concessions in order to overcome from this confrontation. So we have a freezing kind of confrontation with the United States, and it's deliberate on both sides. And from the Russian perspective, it is absolutely affordable and sustainable in the observable future. But in the end, from the Russian perspective, Russia will succeed in its confrontational policy, and eventually the West, which is the only player in the world with whom Russia has confrontational relations. Eventually, both the United States and the European Union, from the Russian perspective, will have to accept Russia as Russia wants to be accepted, right? Which is a legitimate, independent, great power with the central role in the post-Soviet space and equal role in beyond the post-Soviet space. I don't have time now to provide argumentations why Russia thinks so. Just let me say China factor is one of the most significant here, since containment of China is the central focus of American foreign policy, and this is absolutely undisputable and visible nowadays. Already because of China, the United States is interested in stabilization of confrontation. The United States is not providing to Ukraine what Ukraine wants, in terms of membership action plan and revision of the Minsk agreements and so on and so forth. So already because of China today, the United States is interested in stabilization of confrontation with Russia. In the future, from the Russian perspective, the United States will be interested in better relations with Russia, in more partnership with Russia, because it will fail in simultaneous confrontation with the United States. With the non-West, Russian foreign policy is strengthening of partnerships, diversification and building of a balanced systems of partnerships with China as strategic partner number one, but also strengthening of partnerships with other non-Western great powers. India, Southeast Asian countries, the countries in the Middle East. As I said already, the Middle East is already regarded as the major success ground for Russian foreign policy because Russia is already the only non-Middle Eastern, non-regional player which has a balanced system of partnerships with all the major Middle Eastern regional players. And this is how Russia strengthened itself as the globally engaged and globally significant independent great power. This policy in its turn is based on a world vision that Russia has, which is, I would say, twofold. First, the world is considered to be non-Western, which is no longer dominated by the West, right? And the role of the West declining in the world is in general. And secondly, Russia faces a kind of bifurcated global environment with positive and negative trends in the world coexisting, but the positive trends still prevailing, right? And this positive trends is that we are already in a polycentric system. The overwhelming majority of the countries in the world, they do accept Russia as independent global great power. Russia has positive relations with the majority of the countries in the world. As I said, the only player with whom Russia has confrontational relations is the West, but beyond that, Russia has great relations with Asian, Middle Eastern, African, Latin American countries. There is a growing demand on Russia in very many regions of the world. Many non-Western countries wants to strengthen their independence, wants to avoid becoming puppets of the United States or China, avoid joining either the United States or China against each other. And Russia tries to position itself, and successfully does so, as a favorable partner for those countries who don't want to choose, as a kind of a new leader of non-alignment. Right? This is precisely what we hear from Africa. Right? Africans tell us, you are not the United States, you are not the Chinese, this is why we want you, right? I mean, partnership with Russia can strengthen security of those countries, but Russia is not being considered as a potential hegemon in the non-West, beyond the post-Soviet space. Of course, in the post-Soviet space, Russia is considered as a potential hegemon, right? But I'm talking about beyond the post-Soviet space. So even the global system in which there are two superpowers, the United States and China, this is of course challenging psychologically and unpleasant for Russia because Russia is becoming a second-tier countries. But even in this environment, Russia does identify the ways for itself to continue to promote itself as independent great power. And the major reason is this desire of many regional countries like Turkey, like Saudi Arabia, like South Korea, to be independent, right? To stay out of the confrontation between two major superpowers. And in this polycentric world, Russia can find itself and does find itself a role for itself, right? As I said, a second-tier country, but still globally significant, still globally engaged, still a participant of the creation of joint multipolar international order, simultaneously promoting Russia-centrism in the post-Soviet space. I will stop here and apologize if I talked longer than originally expected.
Thank you very much, Dmitry. And I wish we had more time, but I'm just conscious of time and I want to make sure to leave the time for discussion. So thank you so much for being time conscious also. And I usually hate moderators and I have to play this role myself. So I wish we had, we could devote a two-day conference on the subject alone, but let's try to do the best with the time we have. I want to go next to Martin Krah of Sweden for your own introduction. Martin, please.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Susla, for articulating the Russian position. I think that helps us also understand better the language we might need to use in framing our relationship with Russia and understanding it in a long-term setting. And I think language is very important. And the premises that I suggest that the West then should use for its language are the principles of the Helsinki Accords of 1975 and the Paris Charter of 1990, which means respect for human rights, the rule of law, and the non-interference in the sovereignty and territorial integrity of other states. And I think that here, actually, we have some homework to do in the West as well. If you look at how the Ukraine's conflict with Russia is framed by the OSCE, we see that it's framed as the conflict in and around Ukraine rather than a war between two states. The second thing I would like to sort of emphasize is then the long-term implications of the current standoff, the current confrontation. Because we have at the moment in Europe two spheres of gravity, and they're pulling in different directions. We can call them Russia on the one hand and the EU on the other, although that is also a simplification, of course. But the current, of course, conflict is different from the previous one in the Cold War, because then the situation was rather binary. The wall sort of separating the two spheres was also not only a security barrier, but also an economic and political barrier more broadly. Physical barriers are being built not far from where we're sitting at the moment, between the Baltic states and Poland on the one hand, and Russia and Belarus on the other hand. So that's a new physical barrier being created at the moment. We also have new barriers in terms of economy and political systems, in terms of integration. But of course, a major difference is that the current conflict is unfolding on top of the globalization that had reshaped our relations for several decades already. So it's also multi-layered and a very complex one. And when we think about the events in Belarus last year, the rising against Lukashenko, when we think about the aspirations of a large majority of Ukrainians or Moldovans, it's here that we will see the result in the end the result of the conflict between the West and Russia is here that it's here that it will unfold. And at the moment, with the sort of lack of language even of framing this relationship with Russia that we have, I think also the next step should be to think more strategically about the long-term implications of this conflict.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Martin. And I just picked up on something you said there at the very beginning, sort of when you talked about the basis of international relations in the modern world, the Helsinki Accord, the Paris Charter. I flew here from Warsaw, from a small, short, and informal human rights conference, OSCE human rights conference held there, because for the first time ever, the official annual OSCE Human Dimension Implementation meeting, Europe's largest human rights conference, is not taking place because Sergei Lavrov used his veto. The OSCE works by consensus principle, and sabotaged the event, so it's not happening for the first time. And it is, well, first very ironic, but also I think very symbolic of the world we're living in, that this has happened on the 30th anniversary of the signing of another fundamental OSCE document, Martin, in addition to the ones you referred to, the Helsinki Accord and the Paris Charter, the 1991 Moscow document of the OSCE, or CSC as it was then known, established as an inviolable international principle that questions relating to human rights, fundamental freedoms, democracy, and the rule of law cannot be considered internal affairs of a state, and are subject to international concern and international accountability. And it is symbolic that on the 30th anniversary of this document, signed of all places in Moscow, the Russian foreign minister has used his veto to cancel the annual Human Dimension Implementation Conference. But there we are. This is the reality we're living in. I would now like to go and give the floor to Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk.
Thanks for having me. Let me put it bluntly. Russia is a belligerent, aggressive, autocratic, Petrobras, corrupted state. That's my take. And I will tell you the reason why. Vladimir, this is for the first time when I met you in person. And I really appreciate your activity, and I really commend the efforts you undertake in order to support and to fight for civil rights and liberties. You survived 2 attempts of assassination, state-sponsored attempts of assassination. Navalny survived 1 state-sponsored attack of assassination. Nevtsov didn't survive. I will tell on behalf of the state of Ukraine, as a former prime minister, as a wartime prime minister of my country. Vladimir Putin and Russian Federation illegally annexed Crimea. He sent his troops to Donetsk and Lugansk. This is the eastern part of Ukraine. Every single day, pro-Russian proxies and Russian troops kill Ukrainian soldiers. This is the reality we are living in. A speaker just said initially that, Russia set the red lines for the so-called post-Soviet states. We are no longer the post-Soviet state. We are a completely independent and sovereign state. And we will never accept that someone, including Russia, will set any kind of crazy red lines for the Ukrainian people to be or not to be the member of the European Union, to be or not to be the member of NATO. This is our sovereign decision. Look what's happening with the Western world. A few times he indicated that, it doesn't relate to Baltic states. It doesn't relate, this kind of aggressive policy to the Baltic states. It doesn't relate to the Baltic state only due to one reason. Because you, as the Baltic state, are the members of both European Union and NATO. But despite this, what Russia is doing in the Western world, they try to split the unity among the EU member states. They corrupt politicians. They launch a number of cyber attacks all over the Western world. They try to undermine democracy in the Western world. They completely and fully support autocratic and totalitarian regimes like in Belarus, like in Venezuela, like in Syria. So this regime supports the murderers. I strongly oppose any kind of appeasement policy towards Russia. Any kind of voices that already emerged, even among EU member states, to be more cooperative, to pave the way to a more cozy policy towards Russia. This is not the language that Russian president understands. We need to stand our ground. We need to fight for our liberties. We need to set our own red lines, not notorious red lines that were set a number of times in this world and always violated. The red lines or the stones or the bricks in order to defend democracy in these worlds. The weaker we are, the stronger autocrats like Putin will be.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Prime Minister Yatsenyuk. Very strong words, very strong message. I also want to, just as a sort of note on the semantics and the language that we use. This is obviously well understood by everyone in this room and also those who are joining us online. But still, for the record, I think it is important to say that very often when speakers, and this is true not only of this panel, but more generally, use this shorthand, Russia, of course, what people mean is the Putin regime and its policies. It's for those of us who are Russian, that is an important distinction to make.
There's the reason why I indicated a number of times.
Absolutely.
Vladimir Putin.
Absolutely, and this is an important distinction, and it's perhaps more important for those of us in Russia, but I think it's important to make generally. So we will now go to Kate Hansen Bunt, who is joining us from Oslo. She's the Secretary General of the Norwegian Atlantic Committee. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to Riga. I have to say, as coming from a small country on the fringe of the European continent, bordering Russia, but never been to a military conflict with Russia, I feel that the first speech was a bit confrontational. I had planned to say something about our common history with Russia from a Norwegian perspective, because we are maybe the only neighbor of 14 neighbors who has never been invaded by Russia. And that's it's a basic precondition for our rather good relationship also after 2014. Because we have managed to carve out practical issues and topics that we can cooperate on in at least the Barents Sea and in our common geography. I know the previous panel was dedicated to the Arctic, so I will not repeat what was said there. But we have a good relationship on fishery management, search and rescue when people are in crisis, in accidents, fishing boats. Coast guards are cooperating. We have cooperation on border-related issues, people-to-people initiatives in our bordering areas in northern Norway. And even our chief of the military headquarters in Bodø is speaking or have contact with the chief of the Northern Fleet every week. And I think this is so important because we have to avoid misinterpretations and miscalculation, misunderstanding on what's happening on the military front between our countries. Because Norway is anchored in NATO, and if anything happens in our naval areas or in our bordering land areas in northern Norway, NATO will be there. And Moscow knows that. And that's because we have this deterrent position. We can also have a dialogue. And I think that's the most important thing. On a strong military base, to have and pursue a dialogue with Russia, because Russia is not going away. And I certainly am aware that Russia and the Putin regime is very, very different. I'm also proud to come from a country who awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for 2021 to the leader of Novaya Gazeta, Dmitry Muratov, and to a Philippine representative of people working for free journalism, freedom to express themselves. And Muratov just responded that this is dedicated to the 6 journalists that are killed in my newspaper the last decade. I think this is so important. We have to cooperate, we have to pursue a dialogue, but on the base of strength. And we have to support democratic forces, free journalism, and the expression of democratic goals and visions also in Russia and in Central Europe. I think the post-Soviet era is something very strange in my ears, because if you are not respecting the borders in Europe and international law, I think it's problematic for most of Europe. And for a small country, that's our first line defense is international law. I remembered in 1996 meeting Primakov in Oslo. He was traveling around Europe trying to avoid NATO enlargement. But what was his first goal? It was a multipolar world to reduce US influence. And I think Dmitry Suslov is very right when he says nothing has changed. It's continuity in Russian foreign policy. But I don't think he managed to get what he wanted. As I see the international system today, we have two superpowers, that's China and the US. And then we have Russia, a regional power in Europe, a little bit bigger because you are a nuclear power, but in economic terms, many other terms, you are not a superpower anymore. That's the way I see the international system today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your remarks. And I want to second what you said about the Nobel Peace Prize this year awarded to Dmitry Muratov, the editor-in-chief of Novaya Gazeta, also to Maria Ressa, the Filipino journalist, the two laureates. And things like this, messages like this, are really important and powerful gestures of solidarity with beleaguered independent journalism in Russia that is under attack, very often under attack in the most literal sense. And as you said, Dmitry Muratov said that this is a Nobel Prize not only for him and not so much for him as for Anna Politkovskaya, Yuri Shekachykin, Igor Domnikov, Anastasia Baburova, Natalia Stemirova, and Stanislav Markelov. Those are the 6 Novaya Gazeta journalists or co-collaborators who have been murdered in recent years in Russia. So this was a really powerful and important signal. And I do want to take issue with one point that you made at the very beginning when you said, and I quote, that Norway is on the border of the European continent, end of quote. Of course, you are nowhere near the border of the European continent because the border between Europe and Asia lies deep on the range of the Ural Mountains, deep inside Russia, just east of the city of, or no, actually just west of the city of Yekaterinburg. And people go after weddings and such. As one of the most popular places for photographs outside of Yekaterinburg is where you can stand with 1 foot in Europe and 1 foot in Asia, and people take those photographs. And this is actually more than just a semantic point, because one of the biggest differences between those of us in Russia who believe in the democratic future for our country and those who are currently sitting in the Kremlin and in the halls of the foreign ministry is that these people, the people who are in power today, they want to pretend that Russia is not a European country, and we are. Historically, culturally, mentally, civilizationally, of course, geographically. And earlier this year I had a meeting, I was in Vilnius for a conference, and I had a meeting with the foreign minister of Lithuania, and as I walked into his office, he has a big National Geographic map of Europe hanging on his wall. And I shook his hand when we began talking, and I said, Gabrielius, I wish more people in Western European capitals had the same map in their offices as you do, because that really big part on the right of Europe there, that's called Russia. And we are really getting tired of people in the West, still to this day, continuing to call Alexander Lukashenko the last dictator in Europe, because those people who say that, well, either they've missed their geography classes or they think that Vladimir Putin is a Democrat, because those are the only two conditions that would make this statement to be true. But so I think it's just an important point to make and to remember. Last but certainly not least, from Washington, D.C., we're joined by James Lamont of CEPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis. James, over to you.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to join you virtually with this distinguished panel and to provide a perspective from Washington. There are 2 narratives about Putin that are persistent in Western policy circles. One is that Russia is a middling regional power with an economy the size of New York State, but not much more diverse or innovative. Negative demographic trends dependent on resource extraction. It's not a real competitor by any traditional measure, as we were just discussing. The other narrative is that Putin is this evil genius behind everything, manipulating elections, controlling energy markets, projecting force globally, even with limited resources. Both these narratives are oversimplistic, but also have some truth to them. And I think the policy implications of them, however, are quite different, and particularly with that first narrative. Those who take this stand argue that the West should try to work to manage Putin. That it cannot be a real competitor, so there's nothing significant to fear. And in fact, as the West increasingly focuses on China, we should seek to engage Moscow to try to drive a wedge between Moscow and Beijing, modeled after the strategy during the Cold War and engagement with China. I think this line of thinking is more hopeful than realistic. This is because the West has tried engagement for decades. The assumption of Western foreign policy over the last 30 years was that if we engage, it will bring Russia into the international system. We'll be able to export democratic values and market-oriented reforms, and which will lead to a more open political system and a more responsible actor on the world stage. Unfortunately, we've seen the reverse happen as the Kremlin and its allies have taken advantage of the open political system of the West to export corruption, illicit finance, harmful ideology, is repeatedly engaged in military venturism, as we know, engaged in all sorts of malign activities, including use of chemical weapons on NATO soil. I think we underestimate the Kremlin at our own expense. If we look at the tools that the Russian government has at its disposal, a robust intelligence apparatus, a modernizing military, and modernized nuclear weapons with it's almost half the world's nuclear stockpile, military contractors operating globally, an oligarch network that's able to exert non-traditional power on behalf of the government in capitals in Europe, Asia, United States, of course, significant cyber capabilities from both state and non-state actors, and a leading role in an ideological movement that's advocating a more authoritarian form of government. These are the tools of disruption, if we look at them. And perhaps most notably, there's an extreme tolerance for risk and a willingness to continuously push the envelope to see what will be tolerated by the international community. I don't think Putin wants to be a respected place in a Western-led order rooted in cooperation with the West. I think instead he seeks the destruction of that US-led order. This does not mean that we should enter a new Cold War or even seek to completely isolate Moscow. There are many things on the agenda we can work with them on. Afghanistan, Iran, nuclear agreements. But I know many people were critical of the Biden administration's decision to hold the Geneva summit this summer. But I think actually, given the state of relations at that time, and there was almost no embassy staff, communications between the two countries was breaking down. There were nuclear agreements that were being thrown out. There was escalating rhetoric and increased cyber activity, and the relationship between the world's two nuclear superpowers were heading in a downward cycle. So in a sense, holding that summit was a bit of a circuit breaker. But what I do think we need to do moving forward is to reestablish the contours of the relationship. We've talked a bit about red lines and understanding how the relationship between and what the rules of the road are moving forward between Russia and the West. And that is where I think the emphasis needs to be.
Thank you so much, James, and thank you especially for making that point about the Kremlin's export of corruption to the West. The phrase you used, I noted it down. It's one of the, in my view, one of the fundamental issues. It's been said that the largest export from the Putin regime to the West is not actually oil or gas, but corruption. And I think that statement is absolutely true. But it is, of course, a two-way process, and it's important to remember that. And for one side to be able to export corruption, someone else somewhere needs to be willing to import it. And unfortunately, we have seen no shortage of Western politicians, Western banks, Western financial institutions who have been willing to act as accomplices and enablers to this export of kleptocracy and corruption from the Putin regime to the West. I've spent more than 10 years now working to advocate for the Magnitsky legislation in Western countries, legislation that imposes targeted personal sanctions against those Putin regime officials and oligarchs who have made it a habit of stealing in Russia and then stashing away that stolen money in the West. Also, the people who've made it a habit of undermining and violating the most basic norms of democratic society in our country at home, and then coming to the West and buying up properties and enjoying the holidays and so on, and enjoying the benefits and privileges of the very same democratic society for themselves. The Magnitsky legislation is designed to stop this hypocrisy, to stop this double standard. But what is no less important, I think, is to also finally start the conversation about Western enablers. And it was very important in the last few weeks, this new bill that was introduced in the US House of Representatives called the Enablers Act, that this time targets not the foreign corrupt crooks and human rights abusers, but actually Western, in this case American enablers, the law firms, the banks, the financial institutions, who are all too happy to launder and accept this dirty money from Putin and other dictators. And I think that's an important conversation to be having in Western countries as well. I have many questions for our speakers, but I do not wish to usurp my seat as the moderator because we have only 11 minutes left for the discussion part, and I want to make sure to give the opportunity to those of you in the audience physically and also those of our guests who are joining online and are sending their questions, which I can see here in front of me. But for those in the room, because of the sanitary restrictions, we're not able to hand the microphone, so you will see two microphones there, one on your right, one on your left. Please approach the microphone if you want to ask a question. Please identify yourself by name affiliation, if any, and please let us know to which of the speakers, either in person or online, or maybe all of us, the question is directed. So the two microphones you can see. Meanwhile, I will start with a question that we have from one of our colleagues online, and I want to address this question to Prime Minister Yatsenyuk. Is there a model of peaceful coexistence between the West and the Kremlin, meaning, of course, in today's conditions, Vladimir Putin's regime, without letting down Ukraine and Georgia?
Well, completely easy question, and I will try to provide you with the simple but clear-cut answer. There is a solution, and the solution is to make Ukraine and Georgia at least NATO member states, in order to give us a chance to defend our territorial integrity and sovereignty. And the quicker this happens, the more peaceful coexistence between ODKB and NATO, because they usually say, Putin's Russia usually say that you are not allowed to join NATO because this is the red line that we set. Okay, but here is the thing. The Russian Federation established so-called ODKB. This is the Tashkent Treaty you are well aware of.
The collective security agreement.
Whatever. Post-Soviet. This is the real post-Soviet military alliance. So the only solution which is on the table right now is to actually accelerate the process of NATO membership perspectives for Ukraine and for Georgia. And on the other side, it's important for both Ukraine and Georgia to perform well in terms of very strong economic, political, and democratic reforms, to lead by an example.
Could I ask a follow-up to this? I mean, this conversation has been ongoing since at least the Bucharest summit in 2008, when both Ukraine and Georgia were, when it was let known that they will not get mapped the membership action plan. One of the sort of most often sounded arguments against, and it's sometimes, very skillfully thrown in there by the Kremlin propaganda machine, including in the West, arguments against granting NATO membership both to Ukraine and Georgia, is this question of territorial conflicts. People often cite this clause in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's founding documents that countries with border disputes or territorial disputes cannot join NATO. Of course, I know the answer to this, but I want to make sure to give you an opportunity to respond to this publicly, because this is an argument that is often used in very bad faith. Of course, we know very well that this provision did not stop West Germany, for example, from joining NATO when
Absolutely.
The West German constitution listed all the eastern lands as part of Germany, which they were not at the time. But given that both Georgia and Ukraine, Georgia with the so-called independent Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and Ukraine, of course, with Crimea, have sort of unresolved territorial border situations, how does that not stop Ukraine and Georgia from getting membership action plans in NATO?
In 2008, I was one of the co-sponsors of this famous letter of Ukrainian government to NATO to provide NATO membership action plan for Ukraine as a Speaker of the House. It was a joint letter of the President, Prime Minister, and the Speaker of the House. And I was very upset when our Western friends refused to provide the NATO membership action plan for Ukraine. And here is the thing. It's again about the red lines. Russia realized that, look, we actually scared the West with the perspectives of Ukraine and Georgia being NATO members. West leaned back, so we moved the red line, so we can move, as Russia, we can move further. And they invaded Georgia, and then they moved to Ukraine and invaded both Crimea and eastern part of Ukraine. In terms of NATO membership perspective, with the countries that have so-called territorial disputes, illegitimate fake news from the Russian Federation. Nothing is written about this in the NATO Charter, period. So we can be the members of NATO. There are some kind of tactical issues that in case if we join NATO, no doubt that NATO security issues will cover the territory that is fully controlled by the Ukrainian government. But these are technicalities. But formally and legally, there is no any kind of impediment on this way.
Last month, exactly a month ago, on the 16th of September, the European Parliament adopted a landmark report, very big document containing a lot of different issues on the strategic direction of EU-Russia relations. And it talks about all the current problems. Of course, it talks about Crimea, it talks about the war in eastern Ukraine, it talks about domestic human rights violations in Putin's Russia, political prisoners, and so on. It talks about the illegitimacy of the constitutional amendments that Putin pushed through last year, allowing himself to stay in power after 2024. It talks about potential non-recognition on behalf of the European Union of any attempt by Putin to stay in power after 2024, all very important issues. But one of the most, to me, important and symbolic and fundamental things in that EU-Russia report was that there's a whole section about the need to start thinking about a roadmap for future strategic partnership between the European Union and a post-Putin democratic Russia. Because I think one of the main lessons learned from the early 1990s is that how sudden and how quick the changes that took place in Russia were, which left no time for people to prepare. And I think it is very important to learn from that lesson and to start preparing for that future now, because when things start happening, and again, we know from Russian history that political change very often happens like this, when things start happening, it is late to prepare. We have to act. So I want to ask, and our time is almost up, so I want to ask all of our speakers this sort of a blitz question at the very end. How do you see potentially that future strategic partnership, that future place and role of a post-Putin Russia in the European community? Václav Havel famously described the whole process of post-communist transformation in Central and Eastern Europe as, quote-unquote, our return to Europe. He said this in his address to the joint session of the US Congress in the early 1990s. How do you see that future return to Europe by post-Putin Russia? How do you envisage that, and how do you think we can and should be preparing for this today? And I'm going to go in the exact reverse order as we did the first round. So I'm going to ask this question first of James. And please be as brief as you can, because I want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to answer this before we wrap up.
Thank you. I'll be brief, and I'll try to be very specific with a specific recommendation, which is, I think we need to show we are on the side of the people and the people of Russia. And one specific way that we can do that in the near-term future, a specific step, is a response to the effort to take out the smart voting app from Google and Apple. I think United States Congress, for example, could hold hearings about harassment of American companies and the effort to take down the smart voting app. That would be a way to demonstrate that the United States government, United States companies, and the people of the United States are, and the West more broadly, I should say, are on the side of the people of Russia to empower them, period.
Thank you so much. Thank you, James, and thank you for being brief. Kate, Hansen, Bunt, same question, the role of the place of a post-Putin Russia in Europe.
I think the most important thing is to carve out, as Norway has done, practical issues where we can cooperate. And I believe that the strategic dialogue at the moment that the US have with Russia on disarmament is a way forward. We have to do that with the coming regime as well. We have to find small pockets or topics where we have the same interest, where we can, in a practical manner, learn to cooperate with each other. Because I think that we are coming to Moscow and saying, you have to share our values. That will not make a solution. We have to do it from the bottom up, and to make also support of free journalism, democracy for the people who are facing that in Russia today. Thank you.
Thank you. Prime Minister.
I'm not sure I can predict what's going to happen with Russia after Putin leaves the office of the president. I believe that the key priority right now is to figure out how to live with the incumbent president of Russia. Not how to leave, but how to deter Russia. Frankly speaking, I wish you all the best. I mean, I wish all the best to the Russian people and to your nation. And I believe that maybe the time will come and Russia will be an example, will lead not by the power, but by the power of the example as a democratic state. But frankly speaking, I am not sure about this. I want to be very frank. Because the history of our relations with Russia is very complicated, different, and dramatic, I mean between Ukraine and Russia. So the key priority right now is to deter all this aggressive behavior and malign activity of the Russian Federation in the short run. In the long run, this is the key priority for the world and for all democratic states to expand democracy all over the world. And if we expand all these democratic values all over the world, including Russia, so this will change Russia.
Thank you very much. Martin Krag?
For Europe to be free and whole, or whole and free, I'm sorry, but we need the ongoing conflicts in Eastern Europe to be resolved. And for that, we need a democratic Russia.
Thank you so much. And concluding word from Dmitry Suslov from Moscow.
Thank you. Well, I will probably disappoint you by saying that, in my understanding, the Russian foreign policy beyond Putin will not be substantially different from the current Russian foreign policy. There is a very active dispute in Russia on many aspects of Russian domestic affairs. But when it comes to foreign policy, I see nearly a consensus on foreign policy, and it is not a coincidence that Russian defense minister and Russian foreign minister were asked to be the top figures in the United Russia Party electoral list. It is because they are the most popular and successful ministers in the Russian government. So talking about the future of relations between Russia and Europe, Russia and the European Union, I think we should differentiate between short-term, medium-term, and longer-term prospect. In the short-term prospect, this is a combination of remnants of cooperation between Russia and individual EU member states and rivalry between Russia and the European Union. In the medium-term prospect, this is peaceful coexistence and Russia and Europe, Russia and the European Union becoming neighbors rather than partners, with Russia increasingly integrating with Eurasia, with China, and reducing its interdependence and the scale and quality of interactions with Europe, which is regarded as pretty much okay by the Russian foreign policy elite. In the longer term prospect, the future of Russia-Europe relations will largely depend on two things: the state of transatlantic relations, the future of NATO and the role of the United States in European security order, and the state of relations between the United States and China, right? And again, China factor will be very important. If the US-China confrontation is overcome, or when the US-China confrontation is overcome, Russia will have much greater incentives for re-established partnership with Europe. Whereas as long as this confrontation is going on, Russia is absolutely confident and safe for the Chinese angle of its foreign policy. Europe plays a significant but not the most significant role in Russian foreign policy.
Thank you very much, Dmitry. I just want to make one point that you're absolutely right that Shoigu and Lavrov were chosen to lead the United Russia party list in the recent so-called parliamentary elections, but I think it's also important to note that the only way United Russia was able to keep its parliamentary majority was through massive fraud, falsifications, and the removal of most genuine opposition candidates from the election. So I don't think we should read too much into those official election results, and maybe that consensus is not actually as strong as the Kremlin would like us believe. And Martin said a very important phrase, that famous phrase, Europe whole and free, proclaimed by George H.W. Bush in Mainz, West Germany, more than 30 years ago. Again, remembering that map, National Geographic map of Europe, hanging on the wall of the foreign minister of Lithuania. The two largest countries in Europe are Russia and Ukraine, and Europe can only be really whole and truly free when those two countries are part of this one European family. And I think all of us look forward to the day when this finally happens. It is now my honor to welcome here on the stage for the concluding remarks of the 2021 Riga Conference, His Excellency Mr. Edgar Sienkiewicz, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Latvia. Foreign Minister, the floor is yours.
Well, good evening, and first of all, let me just say my great admiration to all of you here who are present for being able to wear the masks and even to conduct the panel. I think that if this thing called COVID continues also the next year, we most probably should establish the Riga Conference Award, the Golden Mask for the best panelist of the conference. But let me really thank everyone, organizers, Latvian Transatlantic Organization and its president, Professor Žaneta Ozoliņa, with all her team, all the supporters and participants all around the world, and of course, all our panelists, both in the room and also online. I think that, as always, this has been rather interesting, thought-provoking discussion about the state of the world. And as always, we find that the state of the world is very bad. Unfortunately, I think that it's not very easy to fix it. And definitely from our perspective, from the perspective of Latvia, it is very important that some key principles, some key very important values keep being sustained in this discussion, in international discussion, and on the global stage. Values that are democracy, human rights, rule of law, also the international law and the international order that is based on rules, not on the power. Unfortunately, we also are seeing that this is not the case. If I should list all the challenges that the world or Europe is facing, that would be, including, of course, also discussions at this panel, a very, very long list. Each and every year, we actually see the new, to some extent, unexpected things appearing. Some 2 years ago, when we were conducting a normal Riga conference, we wouldn't imagine that in a couple of months from then, COVID-19 pandemic would actually influence all of us. A year ago, in November, when we had virtual conference, we were talking a lot about hybrid warfare, we were talking about disinformation, cyber security, but we actually wouldn't imagine that in May 2021, a neighboring country, a dictator in the neighboring country would actually hijack the civilian airline and would arrest some people simply because he really doesn't like what they are writing on social media. And we wouldn't imagine that a couple of weeks later, we'll be talking about migration as a hybrid weapon, as a hybrid operation against 3 EU countries, against the common EU border. So things keep changing. As they are changing, we are not always able to find a proper and quick fixes and responses, but ultimately we do find them. Here in this country, in about 1 month and a couple weeks from now, we are going to host NATO Foreign Ministers meeting that is going to address the new strategic concept of the alliance. Many of things you have been talking have been duly noted. Many of those things that have been discussed in conferences like this, in foreign ministers, defense ministers, and experts level, are going to be discussed and hopefully reflected in the new strategic concept. Definitely we understand that we need to address the notion of hybrid warfare and the response of the alliance, including also Article 5. And we see that actually hybrid warfare can be a very vague thing and that you cannot put a kind of inclusive list onto things that you are done. We are also going to speak about China, how China influences geopolitical security, what should be the response of the alliance. And we also know that to some extent China is also an issue that still needs to be debated more in both NATO and the EU. But by talking about those new challenges, we also should not forget about the old, very well-known threats and risks that we see in our neighborhood, that there is a core function why NATO was established. There is a core function of NATO that still is relevant, and that core function comes actually to the challenges from the east of our border. We are also going to talk about cooperation with our very close friends and neighbors across the Baltic Sea, Sweden and Finland. We are also going to talk, and I very much hope that after some period of time we are going to have some discussion with our friends from Ukraine and from Georgia about what and how we can increase that kind of cooperation we have on security. I don't expect revolutions and breakthroughs, but I think that the process is going to be there. And to that end, the whole Riga Conference has been, to some extent, a very good prep work for me and for my colleagues. Definitely, we are also going to look, and this is the second priority, in a very, very challenging situation that we are all facing already for some years, transatlantic relations. By transatlantic relations, I'm not only speaking about US-Europe, but also Canada-Europe. To some extent, also, I would include right now also the United Kingdom and Europe. I think that we see from time to time other very strong discussions and disagreements, both public and private, among allies. I think this is also very important that we address those things as openly as possible, be it some recent developments concerning AUKUS, be it some not so recent, some long-standing discussions among NATO member states. And to that end, of course, there is still, and this is a big question for Europe, how much the European Union wants to be a key security player in the world, the global Europe. We are talking a lot about strategic autonomy, but if you ask politicians and experts in the European Union or beyond, you will get at least 50 answers of what each of us understand by strategic autonomy. Whatever the discussion there is, I think that one notion is very important, that we understand that Europe needs to be stronger, both politically, militarily, and it needs to project not only soft power, but also hard power. But it should not be done at the expense of our transatlantic relations. Everything that we build should be done actually complementing NATO, also strengthening our relations with the United States, with Canada, and with the United Kingdom. And through that, we can actually speak more in one voice, addressing those challenges that have been addressed so much. Finally, definitely, we are also preparing for Eastern Partnership Summit in December. This is going to be a rather interesting summit because most probably out of 6 countries, only 5 are going to participate. I can't imagine how one country, or I would say country could participate, but how people who are currently holding power in Minsk could participate there. But also our Eastern policy of the European Union needs to be reformed. It needs to meet both the realities on the ground, but also expectations from our friends in Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia. Having said that, I should say also that there is a great deal of disappointment on some internal developments in some of those countries. And unfortunately, only slogans, only nice words and promises are not enough. I do believe that also our partners, our friends in the Eastern Partnership need to somehow mobilize themselves again to show that they are doing a great job, and those people who are actually saying we are tired of Eastern Partnership, and here we have heard a lot of words about also the possible changes in policies, especially due to some electoral processes in Europe, and not only in Europe. I think that our friends also should understand that very much of the future is in their own hands. We can talk here in the concluding remarks a lot. I just want to say that there are going to be many challenges ahead of us, and we understand that. There are many disagreements both within Europe. We still are also debating how much challenges that we see on our plate and that are very important. Notably democracy, human rights, rule of law, understanding in the European Union, how much our cooperation and relations with our friends, the democratic countries around the globe, are important. But I think, and here I would like to conclude, one thing that most probably should be a guiding principle for democracies all around the world, especially now taking into account that there is kind of renaissance of authoritarian or even totalitarian countries, that we can win as democratic community despite only if we keep in mind the words of Benjamin Franklin, which is a rather famous quote: "We must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly we shall hang separately." Even one country, even the big country like United States, can't do everything alone. Small European countries, medium-sized or big European countries also can't do that. But together we have shown that we have been able to change things for the better, and I'm absolutely assured that we are also able to do that in the future. With that, thank you very much for your patience. Thank you very much for your hard work, both on Friday and Saturday, and see you in Riga Conference 2022. As I said, most probably in much easier epidemiological environment and in a more crowded hall. Thank you very much.
We are done.
Dear friends, the last words. When I was opening the conference yesterday, then I mentioned several numbers. And I would like to end the conference on the same accounting note. Just for your information, there were more than 560 online registered participants. There were in total 130,000 people joining conference online. Participants and those who were watching, they were from 56 countries. So we could say that the mission is completed. But one of the reasons why we were able to achieve such a wide audience and to have so many people on board is just because we had a very fantastic team and very fantastic leadership, including Ministry of Foreign Affairs with Minister of Foreign Affairs Edgar Slinkevich, as well as Ministry of Defense with Artis Pabriks and his team. Also, President's Office was engaged in preparations, and many others. But most of all, Lato team with Sigita Struberga and very many young and committed her assistants. So let's join me in applause, thanking them. and the only wish to see you all who are sitting here and those 560 online, to see you in person next year. Thank you.